Replayability. It's something that almost all games strive to have, but few seem to actually pull off. It's the type of thing that AAA studios often seem to get completely wrong, but can send a game made by a single dev into the stratosphere. As an indie dev myself, replayability is something I think about a lot. And about a month ago, something happened to me that completely changed the way I think about replayability forever. I've been running a public playtest for my game, Bloodthief. And to my genuine surprise, one of these levels that takes about 5 minutes to complete has somehow generated dozens, and in some cases hundreds of hours of gameplay for playtesters. So what happened? Why is this janky, unfinished level so compelling and so replayable that some players are playing through it upwards of 100 times or more? I've been watching clips from players, reading hundreds of feedback comments, and poring over hundreds of thousands of analytics events. And in this devlog, I'm gonna go over what I found. The 3-step formula that I'm using to make Bloodthief more replayable. Spoiler alert, it's not to just throw a bunch of random achievements at the player and call it a day. I'm going to pick apart the things that I've done right, some on purpose and some on accident, and more importantly, some of the things I think I screwed up on, and some of the things I can do to make this level even better. Alright, let's dive right in. Let's start this off by taking a look at the first level that players encounter. It has no name and no theme. In the main menu, it's just given the ominous and highly visionary name, Tutorial. When I first introduced it to playtesters a few months ago, I don't think it was replayable at all, really. Players beat the level, and that was it. And what I realize now is that the reason it was so unreplayable was an incentives issue. At some point in the process after I first released this level, I made a simple addition to the game that maybe was one of the highest value changes I've made so far from a replayability perspective. And that change was a timer. It's such a simple feature, and honestly, players expect it because it's in so many games. But adding it completely changed how the game is played, because it gives the player an incentive to replay the level. Before, when a player beat a level, that was it. You either beat the game or you didn't. It was binary. But now there's a moving target for the player to always strive to beat their best time. And in an attempt to make the incentive of improving your best time even more enticing, I added a leaderboard on the end screen. To me, a leaderboard serves two purposes. The more obvious purpose is to promote competition among players, which is an extremely powerful incentive. Look at just about every popular multiplayer game out right now. Like, I've got over 400 hours on Rocket League, but if this was just some game with a campaign where you play against bots, I'd be surprised if I played it for more than 1 or 2 hours. Competition can be a huge reason to replay a game. Leaderboards also provide another hidden incentive that I think is perhaps even more impactful: curiosity. Let's put ourselves in a first-time player's shoes. You just went through the tutorial for the first time. In the beginning it was hard, but hey, by the end of it you started getting the hang of things. You defeat that final mob of enemies and reach that coveted end level screen. Awesome. You beat the level and it only took you 6 minutes. But how was Camera able to do it in 50 seconds? For some players, just beating the level will be enough, but for others, seeing those leaderboard times motivates them to think, yeah, I beat the level, but can I do better? And it's those thoughts that get you to hit that restart button and give things a second look. By the way, it would be somewhat irresponsible for me to talk about how great leaderboards are without bringing up the very thing that plagues their existence: cheaters. Unfortunately, cheaters just seem to be an inevitability when it comes to leaderboards. This is something that even large game studios struggle to keep at bay, and my game is certainly no exception. I'm currently taking a manual approach and just moderating the leaderboards myself, and I'm relying on speedrun.com to be the canonical source of truth for actual competitive speedrunners. I'll take this moment to shout out Truffle, Niviera, and most of all, Nayudi, for setting up and moderating Bloodthief's speedrun.com page. It's thankless work, and it keeps the community fun and fair for everyone, so seriously, appreciate y'all.
You have been promoted. You are now one of my elite employees.
So with leaderboards, the game is adding curiosity to go back and see what other strategies there are to get a better time. But a game can build curiosity in lots of different ways. For example, Vampire Survivors, like all great roguelikes, builds curiosity all along the way by presenting you with periodic power-up choices, and only letting you pick one at a time. Once you finish a run, you can't help but be curious how things would go if you tried again, but made a different choice along the way. I think building curiosity may be the most powerful incentive for replayability. So that got me thinking, what can I add to the game to make the player more curious? Well, besides leaderboards, I also put 4 secrets in the tutorial, and the player is told at the end of the level how many of them they found. For many players, this is enough to make them curious to see what they missed. But Also to see what happens when they find that secret. Is there new content, a new item, a power-up? I think this is a great addition because not every player is motivated by getting the best time or competing with other people. Some players are motivated just by exploring and finding cool stuff. These incentives, competition, choices, curiosity, they get the player to hit that restart button. Different players are motivated by different things, so it makes sense to be multifaceted here and think about the different approaches to incentives that you can take in your game. But incentives are only the first step that I took to make my game more replayable, and only a small portion of the bigger picture here. So that brings me to my next section. Reward the player for replaying. We can dump tons of incentives in our game all day long, but if the player just gets bored a minute into replaying, the player will very quickly learn to just ignore those incentives, and eventually will learn that your game really has nothing left to do that is interesting. Was that secret that they spent 10 minutes looking for just a meaningless trinket? Did the level force the player to approach the game in the exact same way that they approached it the first time? In general, did replaying the level give the player the same gameplay experience that they had on the first playthrough? Or is it presenting something new to the player that is making their replay worth their while? This is a part where I think I got lucky and I kind of stumbled into some accidental replayability in my level. Let's take a look at this part of the tutorial. Conventionally, it plays like this. You wall jump up this ledge here, jump across this gap, hop through these pillars, and get ambushed by this knight right here. You are then faced with a locked door, but thankfully you see a key right in the corner here. So you hop a few more times, grab the key, and go on your way. Okay, now let's go back to this section of the level, but this time let's look at it from the lens of a player that's replaying it and trying to get the best time possible. What most players miss on that first playthrough, and what I even missed when I designed this level, was that instead of walking across the plank right here, you can actually just slide across it to gain speed, jump across this entire gap, and go straight for the key. This saves you a ton of time and is also just a fun set of moves to sequence together. Now, this is a relatively simple and obvious example, but there are tons of little sections like this all over the map where there's the obvious way, and then there's the endless spectrum of non-obvious ways that are faster yet more difficult. What's kind of amazing is most of these non-obvious routes I didn't even make on purpose. What's important though is that the player has the ability to play the game differently on this playthrough. They get to try new things, find new routes, and overall be rewarded for being better this time around. For example, if this alternative route was slower, then what's the point? As for those 4 secrets that I mentioned in the last section, right now I reward the player with a power-up when they find a secret, which can be another awesome way to give the player some fresh gameplay. But I think secrets are also a great opportunity to introduce lore, Easter eggs, or other stuff that didn't really make it into the main gameplay loop. And I'm really excited to do all sorts of weird stuff with secrets. To cap off my point about incentives and rewards, I'm thinking about incentives like a promise that I'm making to the player. And the reward is like me delivering on that promise. With leaderboards, I'm promising that there are some routes and mechanics that the player missed on their first run. And when the player goes back, all the new gameplay experiences that they have deliver on that promise. With secrets, I'm promising that there's some interesting stuff that the player missed. And when they find that secret and get that awesome power up that does some unique thing that they've never seen before, that's the game's way of keeping that promise. One area where I completely dropped the ball on is with these locked doors I put all over the place in the level, like this one here. To me, this door is a promise. The promise being that on the other side of this door is something cool, and it's worth taking the time to figure out how to open it. And yeah, spoiler alert, the door doesn't open. My naive self just put it there because I thought it looked cool, and some players spent hours trying to figure out how to get to the other side, only to find out from me in the Discord that yeah, those doors don't actually open. So in this sense, I broke a promise that I made to the player, and I think that this type of thing hurts a game's replayability. Moving forward, I'm either going to remove the doors or keep the doors there and actually put something cool behind it, so I keep that promise to the player. Quick side tangent, I think the old school graphical style that Bloodthief uses really lends itself well as an environment that keeps its promises to the player. I think a major downside of the hyper-realistic games that we're all used to nowadays is that even though they're incredible to look at, they're chock full of broken promises to the player. Doors that can't be opened, NPCs that have nothing interesting to say, and distant vistas that can't actually be explored. As players, we've kind of gotten used to this, and I think it's one of the strengths of having super simple visuals where theoretically everything you see you can interact with in some interesting way. To cap off this section on rewards, I just want to point out that I'm really just scratching the surface here. Most games have achievements, badges, or point systems that give the player some sort of recognition for their extra efforts, and while I haven't explored this stuff yet for Bloodthief, I definitely plan to. So stay tuned on that and let me know in the comments if you have any ideas for additional ways I can reward dedicated players. Incentives and rewards are how a game may hook a player into the main replayable content loop. But games can only reward the player with surprising new content for so long. We can't all make Baldur's Gate 3, where the game becomes replayable simply because there is just an absurd amount of content and choices to make at every step of the game. I also don't think it's a good idea to balloon the scope of Bloodthief just for the sake of replayability. But that's totally fine, because the games that players play for thousands of hours or more usually get their replayability from something else. Endless mastery. We see endless mastery at play in competitive multiplayer games like Rocket League and League of Legends, where even years after the game has been released, players are finding new skills and techniques to give them an edge over their opponents. And then there are the non-multiplayer examples like Devil Daggers, where you literally just try to survive for as long as you can, and there is no official end. The entire game is literally just an infinite loop towards mastery. But for single-player, level-based games like mine that do have a true ending, there is one form of gameplay that stands above the rest to give your game an endless loop that can entertain players for hundreds of hours, and that gameplay is speedrunning. Speedrunning has already taken off more than I ever imagined it would, and I think speedrunning has taken off so much because of a few key aspects of Bloodthief that I did right early on. Namely, these two things. 1. Most of the mechanics in Bloodthief revolve around speed, which obviously plays really nice with speedrunning. In other words, mastery of the mechanics allows you to speedrun faster. And 2. The mechanics themselves have a high skill ceiling. The first one may seem painfully obvious for Bloodthief, but what I mean by this is that deep mechanics are not going to be enticing for the player if they're not actually useful towards any sort of meaningful goal. In my case, where I want to make a great game for speedrunning, mastering the mechanics essentially should allow you to move faster literally through the space. So for example, I made wall jump take into account the angle at which you're jumping off the wall. So if you're facing directly forward, you'll jump directly outward from the wall. But if you face the wall slightly, you'll actually jump forward a bit, thus giving you a huge speed boost. Having the mechanic work like this rewards players who discover and master this nuance by giving them an edge in their speedrun. So there's an example of how I'm trying to design my mechanics to revolve around speed. This point is a little bit more interesting. How do we make mechanics with a high skill ceiling? Well, this is something that game designers spend their whole career trying to do, so I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I'm an expert on this. But I've come up with a heuristic that I think has panned out really well for Bloodthief, and so I think it's worth sharing here. In one of my prior videos, I talked about how one of my goals for Bloodthief is to have deep and intertwined mechanics. That is, mechanics that are difficult to master on their own, and also interact with the world and particularly other mechanics in interesting ways. I think intertwined mechanics are really fun and lead to some really awesome emergent gameplay. But on top of just being fun, intertwined mechanics serve to expand the overall amount of options the player has at any given moment. For example, if we go back to the room I was talking about earlier, the only reason this level has an alternative route at all is because of how different mechanics interact with each other to create some interesting new options for the player. In the first playthrough, the player just uses the jump mechanic to get from pillar to pillar. And if that really were the only possible approach in this section of the map, it would be totally boring and utterly unreplayable. But when a player is speedrunning, they think a little bit more creatively about how they can use their knowledge of the mechanics to get through the space at maximum speed. And we know from earlier, you can shortcut across this gap by using slide and jump in combination. To present this from a more theoretical perspective, if you have 5 moves your player can make that don't interact at all with each other, then you really only have 5 actions the player is thinking about at any moment. But if all the moves interact with each other, the amount of options that the player has goes up combinatorially. We increase the amount of options we just added to the player's arsenal from 5 to 31. Pair this with levels that present a variety of challenges to the player, and suddenly your game has an extremely high skill ceiling, where the skill is mostly about exploring the decision space and experimenting with different combinations of mechanics in different scenarios, which can be really fun. By the way, if you're interested in learning more about these mechanics and how they can be used for speedrunning, Nayudi and Niviera have done a pretty incredible write-up on a whole bunch of them over on the Bloodthief speedrunning Discord. I'll leave a link to that in the description. It has a lot of demonstrations, diagrams, and even like numerical analysis, and overall it's just a fun read. Go check it out. The other way I increase the skill ceiling is to make mechanics generally easy to pull off, but require a lot more precision if you want to use that mechanic to actually gain speed. I do this with the wall jump mechanic, for example, that I mentioned earlier. There's an infinite range of wall jumps that you can perform at various angles, and getting the optimal angle that gives you the most speed for a given scenario requires a lot of skill. The point I'm taking away from this is how complex and interesting gameplay can emerge from the combination of relatively simple mechanics. I've spent a ton of time ensuring that every single mechanic in Bloodthief interacts in interesting ways with all the other mechanics. This means that the player can use these mechanics in all sorts of weird combinations to get to places that are extremely difficult for me to anticipate. And while this is great from a gameplay perspective, giving the player all this movement freedom does make my life a lot harder as a level designer, as there's also new opportunities for the player to cheese the entire map with some shortcut or just go out of bounds entirely. For example, if we take a look at this other level in the playtest, I completely missed how easy it was to just wall jump, then ledge climb up this wall right here. Look how this speedrunner manages to skip like a third of the map by climbing up the ledge and shooting this gap right here. Moving forward, I'll definitely need to be more careful to block this type of stuff from happening, but I will say players are having a ton of fun finding and executing on these out of bounds routes, so I think it also makes sense to see how I can build these shortcuts into the game and make it part of the map. Like, I have to admit, executing this move right here to get out of bounds is super fun, and honestly is one of my favorite platforming parts of the game, which is kind of hilarious since I obviously didn't design this section on purpose. And that brings me to the final lesson that I've learned in this entire process. Watch people play your game and see what players are doing to make their own fun. In the last section, players went out of bounds and made a new challenge for themselves. And trust me, there are tons of examples of players doing that in Bloodthief. But players have surprised me in other amazing ways too. One of my favorites is the pacifist run, which I have to give credit to my Discord and more specifically the Bloodthief speedrunning community for coming up with. It basically is just beating the level without killing any of the enemies. While at first this may sound kind of boring, it's actually super fun to have to creatively think about how you're going to have to weave around enemies and how you're going to get to certain spots when you don't have air dash and you don't have any blood to fuel your movement. You really have to be careful about preserving your momentum. And while the pacifist run isn't an official part of the game just yet, I'm definitely going to add a badge or achievement for it in a future update. The truth of the matter is, you may have some great ideas as a game designer, but you're not Superman. You're gonna miss some stuff. Your job as the game designer is to find fun, and players are better at finding fun than anyone. So in this video, I outlined the 3-step process that I'm following to make my game as replayable as possible. The first step is to add incentives. Give the player incentives to replay content. Different players are motivated in different ways, so I'm using a range of incentives like competition and curiosity. The second step is to reward the player for replaying. Incentives are like a promise that I'm making to the player, and rewards are my way of keeping that promise and making replaying worth their while. And the last step I'm taking is thinking about how my game can be endlessly mastered. What does that gameplay look like, and how can I increase the skill ceiling of my game to make that quest towards mastery more challenging and more satisfying? Now, keep in mind I'm not an expert in this subject, and this is not an exhaustive study on all the things you can do to make your game replayable. These are just some things that I've observed in my own game making process. If you're interested in trying the game out, you can still join the playtest on Steam by going to the Bloodthief Steam page and clicking this button here. It will automatically let you in and you'll be able to play right away. I'll leave a link to that in the description. If you have fun with the playtest, definitely give it a wishlist on Steam so you get notified when it launches. Plus, it signals to the Steam gods that I'm worthy of their patronage. Also, if you're interested in speedrunning or just following the development of Bloodthief, I'll post the links to the Discord in the description. Alright, that's all for this devlog. Please like and subscribe. Thanks.